Hey everybody, Sam Andress here. Welcome to the Terra Firma podcast. This is episode 3. We're calling this Monday Morning Musings. It's actually Monday afternoon now, so we'll just go with Monday Musings. But I'm going to try at least once a week, preferably and usually on Mondays, to do a solo podcast. They'll be varying in from topical, philosophical, history, current events, a mix mash of all those things potentially. But the goal is just to engage important ideas, important topics, things happening in the world. And sometimes it might be a conversation with somebody else. I think in the coming months, I'll probably be able to get things up and running where I have people on via Zoom. So we'll do split screen stuff, but just baby steps, just trying to get things up and running here. So I've had my first 2 episodes. I've gotten some positive feedback. So that's great. Thank you to those of you out there that have listened and followed on YouTube. If you please would like and subscribe to my YouTube channel. It's very important. It's how I'll start getting traction at some point. And on social media, if you would be willing to follow at Terra Firma Podcast on Instagram, that would be greatly appreciated. As well, my professional and personal Instagram account at the Sam Andress. I am a licensed real estate and mortgage broker here in California. So I would appreciate follows on those feeds as well. And of course, when I make postings, if you wouldn't mind sharing them on your feeds, that would be greatly appreciated. So today for the first Monday morning musings, as I have a sip of coffee here, or I guess I said Monday musings since technically it is 12:45 here in Los Angeles. I want to talk about a couple of things. So there's a lot of things going on in American culture. I'll talk about American culture. I'll talk about Southern California, really, which is where I live. There's a lot of confusion going on around out there, and it's becoming increasingly problematic. And here's what it comes down to is, as a society, we're becoming more fragmented and more tribal based on race, color, religion, sexual orientation, you name it, right? So we're becoming increasingly fragmented and tribalistic because of it as a society. So people are just jumping to their teams. Team Republican, Team Democrat, Team Liberal, Team Conservative, Team Gay, Homosexual, Team LGBTQIA+, blah, 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 Team White, Team Black, Team Filipino, Team Asian, et cetera, et cetera. Now, the problem with this is many. But I'm gonna back up a little bit, and I'm gonna get philosophical here. For those of you that don't know, my undergraduate is in business with a minor in theology and biblical studies. My graduate degree, my master's degree, is in theology, biblical studies, and philosophy. And I don't proclaim to be a scholar. I am fairly well read on the topics. But again, what I'm going to discuss here, which is modernity and postmodernity, I mean, there are so many facets to it. There's so many scholars that have spent their lives studying and writing on just specific variables within each of those philosophical camps, histories. So for those of you that are technical scholars or technical people out there, I love you and appreciate you. But this is kind of like quarterback talk. This is like layman's terms of what modernity was and is, and what postmodernity was and is, and how I see these things playing out in 2023 in America. So we'll jump in right here. Modernity is generally the philosophical school of thought that emerged in the 18th and 19th century. So we're talking 1700s and 1800s, primarily in Europe. Prior to that, in the 1500s and 1600s, we'll talk about René Descartes. You've heard the statement, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I exist, or I think, therefore I am. He was a French philosopher, basically came down to the reality that how do we know anything? How do we even know we exist? Well, I think I'm a thinking entity, therefore I know that I exist. And because of that, I can look to the external world, like this coffee table here, or the walls in this room, or the trees outside. I can touch and feel them, and I'm aware of it, so I know that they exist, right? So that's all I'm going to say about Descartes. You can read up on him. I'll have some reading recommendations here at the conclusion of Monday Musings on the Terra Firma podcast with Sam Andress. But Descartes kind of laid the groundwork in the 1500s and 1600s, because you got to remember that the bulk of human history on our planet has been one of religion and religious wars. And that goes back, and then, of course, along with that, empires. So a lot of killing, right? And Descartes and Immanuel Kant and Francis Bacon and others down the road, John Locke, they really came about to appeal to reason and logic, right? Not appeal to religious fervor or religious sentiment. And that's because religion by definition is tribal. And so if we insist that our language about God or our church language about God is completely exhaustively true and imperative. I personally am a Christian. I have a lot of issues with Christians. I have a lot of issues with a lot of Christian theology. So please don't peg me in with a lot of those folks that may be popping into your mind. But with that said, the appeal was to reason in modernity, right? And so you have Descartes, I think, therefore I exist. I think, therefore I am. You have Immanuel Kant, who showed that reason and logic were critical tools to engage and describe the external world in a truthful manner. And this basically buttressed Isaac Newton and what became known as Newtonian science. And that summarized basically simply as like Newtonian science, you're looking at the world outside to reorient your internal. So my feelings don't dictate what the outside world is. The outside world dictates my feelings, so I orient myself properly towards the world outside of myself. Postmodernity, on the other hand, is the opposite. We'll get into that. So, in summary, we don't start with thoughts and feelings, which are subjective, to describe or create reality. That's the Newtonian science, right? So we have Descartes, Kant, Newton, Bacon. In political philosophy, you have John Locke, who is English, right? Locke was very influential over most of the founders of our country. He was what might be considered later a classical liberal, similar to like Alexander Hamilton and a bunch of other founding fathers and important figures in the nation's founding. And this is all important because as a country, the principles that were found, the United States of America was founded upon an idea, right? Not just an ideal, but an idea, or ideas, you could say. And so it was an intellectual idea that helped through using reason and logic to form not a perfect, but a more perfect union, a more perfect way for most people to benefit the most. Sure, there's absolutely like terrible, egregious aspects of American history. Slavery is terrible. I don't know how to say this lightly. Slavery is pretty much the history of the world everywhere. It still is going on today. So while African Americans had a very terrible and distinct experience around slavery, and I don't want to minimize that, the reality is it was Africans themselves that were selling Africans to the Westerners. So you have to kind of think about the context of the time. We're taking, of course, we abhor slavery. We view negatively, and rightly so, on its history. And we look back and we say, the reality is pretty much everybody in the known world up until that time had slaves. It was a common practice. Doesn't make it right. But again, it's unfair for us to judge people from 200, 300 years ago and beyond with our 2023 rationality, right? Again, there's a lot of things that people didn't know 50 years ago. And it doesn't mean that all knowledge is good knowledge or truthful knowledge either. And we'll get into that. But again, we can all agree truthfully that slavery is wrong. It is wrong because why? From a Christian perspective, the Bible says that we're created in God's image. So the Imago Dei. So by default, because God is creator, and God placed his image in us, on us, we value other humans equally. Now, it doesn't mean we all get equal outcomes, right? But our dignity as human beings is equal because we're all created in God's image, right? So that's my operating principle here. But again, don't hear that as equal outcome because we'll come back to that. That doesn't mean that we all get the same equal outcomes. Even in the Bible, you don't get equal outcomes. Even Jesus, believe it or not, talks about not getting equal outcomes. Crazy as that sounds. So we have modernity can be described as a philosophy that is oriented towards understanding objective reality, right? Its aim is, I think, therefore I am. There's an external world. I'm going to observe. I'm going to take in information. I'm going to test, aka the scientific method, and I'm going to construct truthfulness around those observable realities. I think in some ways, the best of this philosophy is what led to the United States of America's founding. And you can see it culturally in the US when you go to a lot of countries that haven't adopted modernity or enlightenment principles, and you can kind of use modernity and enlightenment interchangeably. You can see in the cultures of those countries that there's oftentimes chaos, oftentimes duress, oftentimes a severe lack of organization. I spent several summers on the continent of Africa. Again, beautiful people, loved my time there. A lot of things over there were amazing that I would never experience here in the US. But one of the chief weaknesses I experience is they don't value time or think about time in the same way that we do. And there's an argument to be made for that, but on the other end of the extreme, they're highly inefficient. And there's a culture of corruption. Now, there's corruption here in the US too, but there's a culture of corruption that doesn't even allow a lot of things to get off the ground in Africa. And I'm saying Africa as a continent because I know there's 60 some odd countries on the continent of Africa, but generally they do, at least the ones I was in, Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda, Botswana, Zambia, Zimbabwe, they have a lot of cultural similarities as well. So when we're talking about modernity, we're talking about 1700s, 1800s, philosophical movement. We're talking about Descartes, Kant, Francis Bacon, observable reality, scientific method, those things. In other words, my feelings don't dictate reality. The observable world dictates to me what is real, and then I order myself accordingly. In other words, I don't create my own reality internally. Shifting to postmodernity, this is the 20th century. So this is the 1900s on into today. You see a shift more towards subjectivity, relativism, and experience-based, quote-unquote, reality. Key players here, and again, this is not an exhaustive list. There's multiples that you could go into, but again, this is just a backside of the napkin summary here. You have Michel Foucault, French philosopher, or Michael Foucault, depending on how you want to say it. Michel Foucault, 1926 to 1984. He was famous for saying knowledge and power are always connected. So in other words, it's the people in power that create knowledge. You could argue that. You could argue that media companies and social media companies to even today they dictate what's allowed to be presented to the masses, and therefore they, as a power broker, dictate what's known, what's knowledgeable, what's in the psyche of the society. And Foucault would say they use it towards their advantage. I'm not sure if Foucault said this, but I think you could go a little further to say his reasoning is that knowledge is a social construct based on what power brokers, Twitter, Facebook, in today's environment, not when he was around, would put out. Back then, it would have been like television news and print media and stuff like that. Jacques Derrida, 1930 to 2004, came around with the idea of deconstruction, and he was known as a textual critic. So his goal was to erase the binaries, that there's right or wrong, that there is black and white. The idea that he was famous, his saying was, there's nothing outside the text, right? And, so basically, if I give you a book to read, you're reading words on a page, but there's not one true meaning to derive from that book. You might read a story and there might be multiple meanings, and you might read a book on history and there might be multiple meanings. And that's because there's nothing outside the text as far as he's concerned. In other words, we each bring our own circumstances, our education, lack of education, our sophistication, lack of sophistication, our stories, our pains, our traumas, etc. And so we're all going to have a different reading of the text and therefore a different meaning. Again, you could see how there's some credence to that. But taking it an extreme, postmodernists deny essentially that there's objective truth. And that's just not the case, because we all agree that this is a table because that's the linguistic term. That's the word. That's the word that we've agreed is shared meaning to describe the function and form of this table and what it does, right? And they can vary in style, but we all understand that it's a table. You sit around it, you stand next to it, you use it to write, you use it to lean on, you use it to sit on sometimes, you use it to eat and share a meal. We all kind of know intuitively, right, when we see it, what it is and what to call it. So how does this matter for today? So in the postmodern world we find ourselves in, that is one that is, for the most part, eschewing objective reality in place of adopting subjective, relative, and experience-based reality, aka feelings. We see it in this shift from, whether or not you're familiar with it, this gender ideology that is floating around out there. And what's crazy is, as a university student in the early 2000s, I saw this. I saw where we are today coming 20 years down the road. And so as I was reading Foucault and Derrida and other postmodernists, and then I was, in my sociology courses and seminars, and again, I went to a private, most would call it a conservative Christian university. And I saw this coming, in the sense of what my professors were teaching. And, this idea that gender is a subjective feeling. And so what happens is you have sex and gender are biologically connected. Okay. Yes. There's a man and a woman. Those are the two genders and sexes that exist in the human species and in the animal kingdom in general. And you don't need to be a PhD biologist to know that. Okay. Which is also another fancy trick they try to do today is, I'm a PhD, blah, blah, blah. So therefore, you need to accept what I have to say without question. Sorry, that's insane. I'll respect you. I'll do my own research, though. Thank you very much. So there's a male and a female, and that's controversial these days. I know it sounds crazy to a lot of you, but that's because for most of history, gender and sex, and they still are biologically connected. Now, what happened in the 70s and 80s and such, in sociology departments and universities in the West, was this notion of gender identity. So what they did with this wordplay was they took a new term, gender identity. So gender is no longer related to sex. It's related to identity. It's related to your subjective feelings. And, 40 years later, we're where we are today, where we see supposedly 4-year-olds that know they're transsexual. Now, I don't know how a 4-year-old, yes, you heard me correctly, there are people out there that think they have a 4-year-old who is trans, meaning gender dysphoric. I'm not sure how that happens when somebody's prepubescent and doesn't even know how to pick their own food. So that's just kind of wild to me that there's people that believe that genuinely. I have friends who believe that. I love and respect them. They're great people, but that's about 10 bridges too far. But there's a lot of social pressure around adopting this sort of false narrative, this false ideology. And again, full disclosure, I come to these topics as somebody who identifies as a classical liberal, so left of center, but I have no pretension that I don't care about the Republican Party or the Democratic Party. I think both in various and differing ways are absolutely terrible for our country, because by default, they're fundraising mechanisms. By default, our elected officials aren't really servants of they aren't public servants anymore. Maybe they never were, but certainly they aren't now, because basically their whole job is to continually raise money so they can get reelected. And the work they do for the people ends up being the work of the people that give them money so they can get reelected. So you don't have representative democracy if that's the case. Like, that's should be obvious to anybody. So it's really troubling because, these days, everything's subjective and everything is they want us to believe everything's subjective and everything's feelings based, and that, we appeal to our own individual feelings. And so that's how we arrive at a place where there are a growing number of people that think it's their right to insist that everybody else knows their pronouns and which ones to use and which ones not to use and when to use them. And these pronouns are not just he, him, she, her. It's they, them, which doesn't make any sense. It's sie, zer, zum. There's about, 80, 100, 120 limitless number of pronouns that are being espoused by people today. And additionally, you have people that would call themselves gender fluid, non-binary. Again, Jacques Derrida, seeking to erase binaries, seeking to erase it's either this or it's that. And so you get people that think, well, on a Monday, I'm feeling like a woman, so I'm going to have you address me as she, her. But tomorrow, I might feel like a man, so you'll address me as he, him. And on Wednesday, I might feel like a nobody, a nothing, an it, a neither, a non-binary, so you'll use they, them. And I am expecting you to abide by my dictation of what you're to call me grammatically. And you can only arrive at that place. We've only arrived at that place if you unmarry gender and sex from their biological connection, and you somehow arrive at something about gender being an identity or a feeling or a subjective personhood, right? Subjective self. And I feel terrible because a lot of these people have a legitimate psychological issue. They have gender dysphoria, right? Up until, I don't know if the DSM-5, if it's still in there, I should probably check that. But I know that the American Psychological Association receives a lot of pressure politically, financially, et cetera, around these things. And what's sad is in our country, rather than getting these people the mental help they need, and maybe for some of them that are older, it might mean some quote unquote gender affirming care. It might mean them deciding they want to do some sex changes, but that shouldn't be the first thing that we're doing. We shouldn't be engaging kids with puberty blockers and telling 6-year-olds or 7-year-olds that what they are as a boy or a girl, they may not be, and that they can be open-minded about it and someday later determine what they are, what their gender is, or not determine a gender at all. Like, that's crazy. And I will die on that hill. I will call that crazy forever. And what's really wild is it's a lot of typically sane and rational people that have adopted this hook, line, and sinker because they feel social pressure, because they feel that, especially here in Los Angeles and California, like a lot of people, if you're watching this, you probably think I'm a conservative. You probably think I'm a Trumper. Why? Because I'm a white man. I'm reasonably well off. I'm heterosexual. I'm educated. I own a business, and I'm critiquing gender ideology. So you automatically think that I'm probably transphobic, homophobic, all these phobics. And I don't fear any of those people. I firmly believe people have the right to identify and feel however they want. None of us can tell somebody else how to feel. On the same token, nobody has the right to dictate a false reality. Again, a reality that says this table's a table and this is a microphone I'm speaking into. If you have a penis, you are a man. If you have a vagina, you are a woman, if you're born those ways. If you change those things and choose to mutilate your body to appease some sort of internal feeling, emotion, identity, that's your choice, but it doesn't change the reality of who you are. That's just fact. Okay. We'll take Caitlyn Jenner. Bruce Jenner was a man for several decades, won the gold medal in the decathlon, was arguably the greatest athlete for about a decade in the whole world. And all of a sudden, decided he felt like he was a woman, or maybe it was gradually over time. But again, Caitlyn Jenner is free to think and feel however Caitlyn Jenner wants. But Caitlyn Jenner is really Bruce Jenner, the man that was born in space-time reality. So I have no beef with transsexual people. I have no beef with homosexual people or the LGBTQIA plus, whatever it is. I do think it's getting a little bit outlandish. Again, why did the LGBTQIA plus, why did it grow? Because again, we're dealing with people that view reality as completely subjective. Now, there are certainly subjective aspects to our experience of reality. But a car has wheels, it rolls down the street. It doesn't fly, even if you want it to fly. It doesn't fly. It doesn't hover. At least I haven't seen a hovering car yet. Maybe we'll get there one day. But this is the thing that's troubling our society too, is for me to say what I'm saying, that I respect people's rights to feel and think how they feel and think, but I refuse to allow them to dictate a false reality onto my children, onto my community, and onto other people. What they do is they call you a bigot, a transphobe, a homophobe, whatever phobic they can call you, a racist, whatever, because that's the only way they can shut down dialogue. That's the only way they can shut down a conversation. If you call somebody racist, if you call somebody transphobic, homophobic, you're basically saying, I have no capacity to engage you and the questions you're bringing up and the points you're making. So what I'll do is I'll just make a totalizing claim against you that a large number of mindless, brainwashed people in our society have agreed is terrible, which those things are terrible. And I'll call you that. And then therefore you'll be ostracized, you'll be outcast. And then I never have to deal with myself anymore. And I don't have to listen to you. And then you'll be blacklisted. That's essentially what's going on. It's kind of like Salem witch trials type stuff, right? Read up on the Salem witch trials. It's kind of what's happening today. It's like a social contagion. It's like a mass hysteria in some ways. And I think we can all root this back into the postmodernist shift philosophically that went through our universities for the last 50 plus years and now is coming home to roost. And it's because it's primarily ordered around subjective, feeling-based approaches to reality and the world. There is no objectivity. This is how we arrive at a place where there are people out there that would say mathematics is racist. Again, Foucault, knowledge is power. It's the powerful white people that set up math so that all you poor oppressed people can't understand it. And therefore, it's wrong, right? You got to overturn it. But 1 + 1 is 1. It always has been and always will be. If I have a ball and you have a ball and you give me one of them, I now have two. I mean, it's it's pretty basic. Now, you could argue what's racist is that there may have been systems, or there may be systems that make it more difficult for, say, Black communities to excel in math. I'm not saying that's the case, and I don't know, but I'm just giving an example. But you could also say there might be cultural differences that vary between white people and Asian people and Indian people and, say, Black people and Latino people. Again, I'm not making a data claim here or a factual claim. I'm just saying there may be cultural practices that some groups value education more historically. And there are poor groups like Indian people that come over here generally are not economically mobile all the time. And so, but they value education. Chinese people from Asia, the Asian region of the world, they tend to value education. They tend to not care about your feelings. They tend to care about objective reality. They want their kids to succeed. They want their kids to work hard. They want their kids to perform. They want their kids to become something honorable, right? That's not necessarily the case for all cultures. If you look at Latino culture, in a lot of cases, they want their kids to work hard to create sustainability for the family, to be contributors to the family, right? There's different objectives and goals. You could say white America values individualism. They want their kids to work jobs. They want them to work hard. They want them to be successful, and they want them to be on their own. Not all cultures value people breaking off from the family unit, right? So again, these are general things to think about, but they come into play. And, at the end of the day, I think the modern and postmodernist shift is where all this stuff is rooted in. So postmodernity, a couple of books I'll mention if you want to read up on modernity and postmodernity. So if you're going to read anything by Rene Descartes, you want to read Discourse on Method. Okay. That's kind of his seminal work and again, a lot of these are very cheap audiobooks or digital books. In this Discourse on Method is where he makes a statement, I think, therefore I exist. I think, therefore I am. Cogito, ergo sum. Immanuel Kant, you'll want to read The Critique of Pure Reason. For Michel Foucault, you'll want to read Discipline and Punish. That'll talk about knowledge and power. That'll talk about we're talking about when we talk about postmodernity and postmodernism. And then Jacques Derrida, there's actually a couple, but the one I'll recommend is Grammatology. This is the one where he gets at the notion of deconstructing things, deconstructing grammar, deconstructing language, deconstructing written text. And again, there's the subtle notion of power. In other words, those who publish dictate knowledge, and therefore, again, that's how you're controlled in a sense. So Um, I think it's really salient because as a country, if we don't have the capacity to describe and agree upon objective things, we're in a really bad place. For better or for worse, countries need to thrive and survive by having a shared identity. And diversity isn't necessarily a bad thing, but I think in America, our fetish like obsession with diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI, it's really going to hinder us, because if you look at America historically, a lot of people don't realize this. When Italians came over here and Irish came over here and Swedes came over here and Germans came over here, they were also ostracized. They were also oppressed. I'm not saying they were enslaved like African Americans. They weren't. But the notion that they didn't face adversities and discrimination just is not historically true. It's not historically accurate. Again, I'm not equating the two. I'm just saying a lot of people don't realize that. And so we really got to sit back and say, as a country, what used to happen is when people would immigrate here, they adopted becoming an American. They adopted the American way, the American ideal: freedom, liberty, individualism, loyalty to country, right? In some ways, I think as a nation, the fact that we don't make English our official language and encourage everybody to learn English when they come here, I know some of you are going to take this the wrong way, but I think that's a massive cultural error on our part, because culture matters and language is culture, right? If I move to France, I'm going to be severely limited if I don't learn French, because I'm not going to understand the part of learning French and being there is part of what's going to help me adapt to the culture. And so in America, we have a lot of this, which is, again, kind of in between modernity and postmodernity, this idea of multiculturalism, this idea that a bunch of cultures can exist alongside each other coherently. And I think that's what we're seeing the breakdown of, is that, America is very different in a lot of places. I'm from Southern California. I've lived here my whole life, but I've been fortunate to travel the world, but I've been even more fortunate to travel all over America. I've been to the South. I've been to the Northeast, Midwest, Northwest, et cetera. I've probably been to, 40 of the 50 states. And there's a lot, economics, local climate, local politics, all those things, resources dictate microcultures within America, within one country. And so you go to the South, it's very different than the West, and there's a history there. You go to the Northeast, it's very different. And it used to be, historically, we had some shared values that bound us together, and I think we have less and less of that. And I think people feel less of an obligation to, I think part of it is a product of America's success, when so many people become so successful and so wealthy. And I'm aware that we have a lot of poverty in the U.S. We have homelessness. We have a lot of issues. I'm very aware of those things. But only in a nation where we become so successful, so rich, people start finding things to seek out meaning. So they question gender. They question that you have mental health issues. You have all these things that arise. You don't see them as much when people are like in survival mode, right? So on the African continent and probably in Central America, places that I've been, people are pretty much day to day. People aren't thinking long-term trajectory. People aren't self-reflecting so much. They aren't constantly bombarded with criticizing messages. I don't think you see as much mental health issues as you do here. Maybe trauma-related stuff for sure when there's war and stuff like that. But my point is that having shared language, having shared culture, it's meaningful, and historically wars have been the way it seems that the U.S. has rallied shared culture, shared meaning, because again, when you have a common enemy, you all band together around it, like at 9/11, right? That wasn't a war, but our country was attacked, and all of a sudden we banded together, and we had an enemy. And then now today, you don't really have that. You have tribalism. You have warring culture wars, and the culture wars are very real, because most people correctly believe that there are two genders, and so they don't want their kids taught by some Berkeley graduate sociology degree teacher, English teacher at their local public school that, they can sit down and reflect at 5 years old on, whether or not they're actually a boy or a girl or a nothing or an in-between or a non or whatever this, frankly, bullshit that they spew is. And that person's parroting that because they've been indoctrinated into that, by the sociology department that they took classes at, I'm using Berkeley as an example, but, it's even the private Christian liberal arts university I went to. So all that to say, hopefully if you're out there, maybe a few of you care about this, you notice what's happening, like myself, you just didn't realize that a lot of it is the byproduct of the shift towards postmodern philosophy that inculcated our universities in the 60s, 70s, and beyond, 80s, 90s, 2000s, and even through to today. And it's really concerning. So what do we do about it? I think the silent majority has to become the vocal majority, and we have to be able to speak out. And again, I don't hate anybody. I don't hate anybody. If a child is struggling with gender dysphoria, I genuinely feel compassion for that. I genuinely feel that they have a psychological issue that needs real medical care and psychological care, not puberty blockers and mutilating surgeries that, if we look at it, probably are a new income opportunity for the medical, surgical, pharmaceutical, industrial complex that we have in this country. If you don't think so, I wasn't around at the time. I don't think it was happening in the 80s, but those of you that are older than me, you remember when lobotomies were done, and they were done well after they were known to not do anything of use of what their aimed objective was. So all that to say is, just because you think that it's helping somebody, it doesn't necessarily mean it's so. And just because a doctor says it, unfortunately, as with everything, when there's money involved and big money involved and big industry involved, there's a history in our country of things being permitted to happen that are not in the best interest of people they're being provided to. And that, if you just have a basic, satiant understanding of the world around us, that's the case. So I'll continue to speak out about it. I'll continue to show compassion where I can. But man, that's one thing that I'm not going to let slide. And I think that, I'll even talk a little bit more. I'll go further. We also see it, the postmodern shift. We see it in our society around this notion of like I call it the grievance brigade or the victim society, the victimhood society. Is that more and more people, rather than taking self-ownership, it's becoming increasingly easier to blame somebody else for the way they feel. I feel disaffected. I feel like I haven't accomplished what I have. I feel like I don't have the things I should have. Historically, people in America went out and tried to make a way and make that happen. And I agree, it's become increasingly hard and difficult and complex. But there's always going to be somebody who has more. There's always going to be somebody who has an advantage. That is never going to change. That is the way. Now, we should fight for equal opportunity, but even that fight, there's never going to be a time where everybody has the same level of opportunity and access. There just isn't. And you have to come to grips with that. And you have to realize it. And I say this, you're probably thinking, oh, you're a white guy. I grew up with a single mom. I grew up with a dad that was mentally ill until I was 2. He was out of the household. He was schizophrenic. Nothing of his fault. Fortunately, he was willing to take his medication, and it helped him be at least stable enough to be in a semi-locked facility. I rode the bus growing up, right? So in some ways, I was severely disadvantaged over my peers that I grew up with. Now, I was still advantaged over people that grew up in, say, Central America with no running water and no plumbing and no education and no health, no modern medicine, or that grew up in, the jungles of Africa. Yeah, I was advantaged over them, but I was severely disadvantaged. I think you could make the case, data-wise, odds-wise, severely disadvantaged over my peers that I grew up with, who were generally affluent, generally had brand new cars, luxury cars on their 16th birthday, generally went on 2 to 3 to 4 vacations a year. Parents were business owners, lived up on the hill, had pools, jacuzzis, et cetera, right? So again, I'm not bringing out a violin to say, feel sorry for me. Don't. Fortunately, I didn't choose to be a victim. I didn't choose to say, well, what was me? I was born to a single mom. We rode the bus. My mom wasn't very educated and, wasn't a business owner, and I don't have any resources. And I fortunately had fantastic grandparents who loved me, because I wouldn't be where I am today without them. But, and then my dad, why was I born with a dad that, developed schizophrenia? Hey, I could sit around and make all kinds of excuses. And at the end of the day, I'm glad I didn't. I didn't have somebody modeling to me what it looks like to go to college. I had to figure it out. I had to take out student debt to do it, right? I didn't have somebody that told me, hey, this is how you get connected and you get a good job. I just asked questions and I sought out people. Hey, my friends who are coming from families of means, they're in these industries. Okay, I'm going to talk to them. I'm going to figure it out. I'm going to ask questions and then kind of try to piece it together. That's what you got to do. And you have to assume that the world owes you nothing and nothing's going to be handed to you. Now, if things do get handed to you, that's a blessing. That's great. That's take that and make more of it, right? That's what I've tried to do with what's been given to me. And, but at the end of the day, it still matters what you do, your discipline, the things that you go after, the things that you seek, right? And I feel like today we have a lot of people that are very much on the bandwagon of complaining, victimhood. And again, sure, there's some people that have experienced incredible traumas. There are cultures and people groups, the Black experience in America, I mean, it's ironic to me because Martin Luther King was all about, we don't want to be judged. He dreams of a day. We don't judge people by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. But so much of what is going on in our society today is exactly the opposite of MLK. And it blows my mind. It blows my mind. So much of what we're doing is defining people by the color of their skin and creating special privilege for them because of the color of their skin. And as somehow that's a means of making up for past wrongs. And unfortunately, what it does is it entrenches an even greater racism and a greater tribalism. And, part of what we probably need to do in America is create a truth and reconciliation that really creates a proclamation about how wrong slavery was. You've got stuff like, we just have a bunch of half-baked ideas. You've got San Francisco, you've got, I don't know if it's their board of supervisors or some political group basically saying that, blacks in San Francisco should be given $5 million and a house for $1 and like $90,000. It's absolutely crazy. It's absolutely insane. First of all, California never was a slave-owning state. Second of all, there's no slaves that are still alive. If there was a living slave, then I would say, yeah, they deserve reparations. The generational wealth argument, sure, maybe kind of, but you know what? My ancestors came here probably 8 generations ago from Sweden, and one of my grandparents, I was able to get the manifest at Battery Park at Ellis Island, and I was able to see that she came over with the equivalent of $5 to today's money, okay? And and came over on a ship that had no guarantees. In other words, there are people that died on the ship that she came over on, one of my great-grandmothers. So I'm not equating her experience to that of African slavery, but what I'm saying is, again, all of us in our family lineages, in our ancestry, have people that struggled and were slighted in various ways for the most part, to varying degrees, and that's because that's just the history of the world, right? I bet you my great grandma thought, hey, this is a great opportunity because there's famine and economic ruin right now in Sweden. So I'm going to go to America and I'm going to try to make something of myself, and hopefully I make it over there. And if I do, I'm going to do the best I can. And she did, right? That's not going to happen if you have a victimhood mentality. That's not going to happen if you are somebody that sits around and thinks something's owed to you. But again, I think, man, in our society, we're increasingly thinking that's the case today. So many people are thinking, somebody owes me something somewhere. My life isn't what I want it to be. Therefore, it's somebody else's fault. Well, maybe there's some challenges that were put in your way that were not your doing. But regardless, what are you going to do about it, right? Are you going to be objective? Are you going to look at the world as it is? Or are you going to look at the world about how it was and how you wish it would have been? I mean, which one are you going to do? Because we're probably only going to live 70, 80 years if we're lucky. And if you're 30 already, you better get to work. You better get to work. And maybe that means going to college. Maybe it doesn't. Maybe it means starting a business. Maybe it means working 2 or 3 jobs, right? So what I'm saying is so much of what I see from young people today, and now somebody who's in his 40s, I can look back on that and say, young people, younger people, younger than me, in your 20s is about unrest. Your 20s is about having roommates. Your 20s is about renting a studio apartment and barely making it. Everybody was in that position roughly, except for maybe the baby boomers. We won't shit on them too much right now, but they had it the easiest of any generation. They got to grow up in the 60s, critiquing the power structures, and then they become the corporate managers and boardroom directors and saw the greatest economic rise in the history of the world and inherited the most wealth in the history of the world, presently inheriting it. We won't get into that right now. Maybe that'll be another podcast episode. But regardless of what the boomers or whoever may or may not have done to screw America or screw our economy or whatever, so what? Right or wrong, you are responsible for you. You're responsible for understanding objective reality, not letting your feelings dictate past or present or future, right? And getting out there and understanding what's your goals, what do you need to do to achieve those goals, and who do you see that already has those goals achieved, and what is it they did and what is it they're doing, and then go seek them out. It's that simple, and you got to be relentless about it, okay? So switching gears here, I'm going to try to keep this at an hour. We got about 10 more minutes here. I want to talk a little bit about the Nashville shooting and just shootings in general. Okay, I say this as a father. It's very difficult to talk about this. It's weird because I think we all experience that. It's on social media 24/7 when these shootings happen. It's on 24-hour news. We kind of are like numb to it, and then we forget about it until the next one happens. Maybe that's just my experience, but I'm assuming a lot of us have that similar experience. And so what I want to say is this. The right and the left, the Republicans and Democrats, again, because these politicians that are quote unquote elected they're not public servants anymore. They are perpetual fundraisers, okay? And they are beholden, the business of the people that they do is for those that give them the funds, okay? Let's get that straight right off the bat. They might do something once in a while for a photo opportunity, but let's not get things mixed up. So here's the deal. At the end of the day, there's 300 to 500 million guns floating around in the U.S., most of them legal. There is no way in the world that we're going to ban guns in the U.S. That would create a civil war, and there are enough people with enough guns to make that happen. I don't want that to happen. I would never want that to happen. However, it's possible. So there's just let's deal in like what's actually possible. So on the one extreme, on the right, you have people that you can't even talk about reasonable gun safety, gun control, red flag laws. Just the conversation itself is a violation of the Second Amendment. That's bullshit. That's not a rational position, but it's good for their fundraising. Again, because they're fundraisers, these politicians. Now, the people on the left, Democrats, it's like let's ban assault weapons. Okay, well, here's the deal. Any weapon that's a semi-automatic weapon, which is pretty much the majority of weapons in the U.S. that are legally owned, has the ability to be an assault weapon. In other words, a 40 Smith & Wesson, 40 caliber semi-automatic Glock or handgun with enough rounds in it is going to be just as lethal as a quote-unquote AR-15, which actually shoots a smaller round. The shooter in Nashville didn't actually have an AR-15. She actually had a carbine rifle that was modified and was shooting, I believe it was 40 millimeter. It was shooting a handgun round, I believe. Again, it wasn't your typical AR-15. The point in all of this is a semi-automatic shotgun can do the same thing. People that have mental illness, bad intentions, whatever it may be, they will get their hands on guns legally or illegally. I guarantee you that. For the most part, gun laws only apply to law-abiding citizens. And law-abiding citizens, for the most part, are not the ones that are shooting people. Okay. And that's borne out in the data. You can look that up. Now, here's the deal. There's a lot we can do that's rational. I think with the amount of money we spend on so many things in this country, it should be a given that every school should be retrofitted with limited access. I know we want our schools to be like prisons. I don't want my schools to be like prisons, but there should be limited access. So it should be like banks have controlled access where you go through one door, it has to be buzzed in, and then you're locked or whatever, and that you can have armed security, have these side doors secured. There's no more side door access. You got to have self-closing. There's a lot of things that are not my expertise that can be done to secure schools, not make them feel like a prison, but make it known that it's secure, right? Those doors can have bulletproof glass on them. Is this going to be expensive? Yes, it's going to be expensive, but it will save lives. And this is off the assumption that we're not going to ban all guns. Even if we do ban guns and we create laws saying no more guns to be sold in the U.S., there's still 300, 400, 500 million guns floating around. You can print a gun on a 3D printer at your house if you want to. Guns are not going to go away, okay? They're not going to go away. So let's be serious about things and say we should have trained armed security at all schools, okay? We should have bank-like locking bulletproof mechanisms on all entryways and, of course, the main entryways to all schools. That should be a federally required law. I'm open to the conversation of if some teachers, after a psych evaluation, maybe they have a concealed carry permit system or whatever, want to be armed themselves. Again, I realize you probably don't want an armed gun on somebody in a class. Look, I'm just saying there's a conversation there, right? I don't think it's the solution, that's for sure. But again, we got to stop ostracizing everybody's ideas and start putting ideas forth that are actually solutions-based, not political fundraising-based, okay? And so I think that's part of it. I think another thing we can do is say, hey, parents, if you own firearms, you have an obligation to keep them locked up. If your child accesses a firearm and commits a crime, you are going to be criminally liable, not just civilly, potentially, but criminally liable. Okay, I'm a gun owner. That puts a level of seriousness behind me securing my firearms, behind my child, me knowing what's going on in my child's life. Apparently, this Nashville shooter, the mom knew that she had a gun or had guns, but thought that she had sold them and got rid of them. Saw her walk out of the house that morning with a red backpack, asked her what was in it, and she said, oh, nothing, da-da-da-da, and she had guns inside of it, okay? Look, this is part of a culture of, we have parents these days that think, oh, I can't go in my kid's room. I don't care if you're 28. If you're living in my house, I'm going to know everything that's going on in my house, which means I can come in your room. If you don't like it, don't be 28 living in my house. Period. Okay? If you're 19, you're 18, you're 16, you're 15, I'm going to know what's going on in my house. I don't care if it's the room I let you use. I'm going to know what's going on. Period. So I just think there's a lot that we can do around having conversation around real life measures that are not going to be perfect. They're not going to necessarily prevent every single shooting, but they'll probably slow them down a lot. We could also look at the media and say, you are not allowed for 1 year or some conversation around a certain length of time to report the shooter's name or image on any media source. Because I think part of what fuels, you look at 1999, I think it was, 99, 97, 98, 99, Columbine High School in Colorado, the most recent, or the first mass shooting. I was like graduating high school that year. And from then on, what's changed? More social media, more devices, more connectivity, more loneliness, more anxiety, more disconnection for youth. And people that are still forming their brains, that's a lot to handle, right? It's created anxiety and mental illness. And so at the end of the day, we really need to look at that and say, hey, we should dial this back and say, these are things that have to be taken into account. Like, what has changed that's culturally made these things happen more? And so probably the 24-hour media cycle, probably social media, these shooters being posted, again, constantly, right? It I think allows people that are desperate or have anxiety or mental illness, this is their shot to identify with something or somebody or whatever it may be. We got to stop, I think, glorifying it in the media indirectly, because I think it becomes a self-perpetuating cycle. So again, I bring these up to say there's real world conversation things that, you might have hated some of the suggestions I made. You might have been like, oh, maybe there's something there. But again, if we're not going to have the conversation, we're never going to come to some formidable measures that can be taken consistently across the U.S. Red flag laws, gun safety laws, gun licensing laws, et cetera, et cetera. Unfortunately, what's crazy to me in America is the hodgepodge around gun laws. From state to state, even county to county, gun laws can vary. I live in Los Angeles County, very difficult to get a concealed carry permit. We have San Bernardino, Riverside County, and Ventura County right around us, and Orange County. Pretty much you just go fill out a form and have an interview, and you're going to get a concealed carry permit, which is just wild to me, and they're good through the whole state. But because you live in Los Angeles, somebody who lives in Los Angeles, kind of like myself, you're pretty much penalized, or it's a very extreme process to try to get one. But everybody else around us in other counties can have a concealed carry permit throughout the whole state. So again, a lot of inconsistencies in how we deal with gun laws and gun carrying in this country. That needs to be rationally addressed. Okay. So I feel terrible for the families to see 9-year-old kids, murdered. Terrible. Thank you to the police officers who responded in a very difficult situation and ended the threat. Unfortunately for the family of the shooter, she had a family too. This is all terrible stuff. And so it's like almost too much to process mentally, right? And, we always say thoughts and prayers, but I think the best thoughts and prayers we can do is start having concrete discussions around real world money and resource and systems and structures that we can put in place and implement to vastly minimize these things, rather than the whole ban assault rifles, don't even talk about it. Ban assault rifles, don't even talk about it. That's just a fundraising game, folks. That's not serious talk. So anyways, I hope everybody's having a good start to their week. I know I talked about some heady stuff. A lot of it I glossed over, some of it too. The point was just to give you a frame of reference for some of these things. Hit me up in the comments. Hit me up in the DMs. Let me know if you have any other questions. If you have more info on modernity and postmodernity that you can educate me, I'm all ears. I don't proclaim to be the expert. Again, I'm educated formally in some of these things, but I was trying to give a summary so you could see how these things have worked their way through our university and the implications for our current societal events. And then of course want to talk about the gun issue, and try to bring some real talk. I'm sure that's going to be an issue that comes up in future podcasts with some guests. But I have some guests coming on here. I'm hoping to have my colleague and my title rep, Eric Avalos. He is a real estate industry expert. I love Eric. I respect him. So he's going to be coming on the podcast here hopefully this month. I have another friend and colleague who's a loan officer, Dallas Rutherford. He's actually working with me to figure out when he can come on the podcast. So I'm excited about that. And then I have a few other friends and colleagues scheduled to come on the podcast as well. We'll hopefully have nice hour or so conversations and have some good banter. So everybody out there, have a great rest of your week. Sam Andress, Terra Firma Podcast. I am your Southern California real estate and mortgage resource, and I hope everybody stays well and healthy. We'll see you soon.